So, Professor Hicks, welcome to this podcast. I thank you very much that you're here with me.
Great.
So,
sure. My pleasure.
Yes. You're a professor for philosophy at the Rockford University, and you wrote,
Yes.
I guess, 2 books. Nietzsche and the Nazis is one, and Explaining Postmodernism is the other one.
Yes.
And I wanted to talk with you a little bit about postmodernism because I think a lot of what is happening today in the world is somehow related to postmodernism. I'm thinking about gender questions. I'm thinking about those student riots in those evergreen colleges, and even in Germany, in the Magdeburg University, where a biology professor was supposed to talk about the biological roots of gender, and there was basically a riot.
Yes, unfortunately, yes. The practical implications of postmodernism are widespread now.
Yes. So and fake news somehow related to postmodernism, I think, because
Sure. Yeah.
But on the other side, it seems to me there's no broad consensus about what is postmodernism. I mean, you can ask academics, and they have completely different approaches to that. If you talk to normal, and quote, normal people that don't have any conception of it, what it actually is. So how, and this is my question, how can we approach this topic of postmodernism, and how can we boil it down? Are there some tenets or principles of postmodernism to understand what that is?
Sure. Yes. Well, you're right that there is widespread debate even about what postmodernism is. Partly that's because postmodernism is a very broad philosophical movement, even though it is in large part anti-philosophical in some of its themes. But any philosophical system takes very broad positions, and within those broad positions, you would expect there will be a number of competing sub-debates, and people in different disciplines, law, history, gender studies, and so forth, will typically focus on some of the sub-debates. And so it's often difficult to see connections between one sub-debate and other sub-debates.
Yes.
I think another challenge here is that postmodernism is opposed to a lot of the precision and kind of analytic clarity that's characteristic of other philosophical movements, and this shows up in its rhetoric and in its content as sometimes intentionally being obscure or using rhetoric in ways other than to try to communicate precisely and clearly. But if we look at the leading intellectuals, right, those whom most people will say these are the heavyweight intellectuals of the postmodern movement, we do see that they were very philosophical and very clear in what they saw their movement as representing. So I'm thinking, of course, of people like Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida. I would add someone like Richard Rorty, perhaps not quite as extreme in postmodernism, but the American Jean-Francois Lyotard, and then any number of other world-famous intellectuals who are often put under the postmodern label. Now, the name itself, mostly came from, at least in intellectual circles, from Lyotard, who talked about the postmodern condition.
Yes.
This suspicion about meta-narratives, the standard phrase that he uses there. But if you think about just the phrase, it is post-modern, you break it down. That then is to say that we are to think of modernity, or the modern world, or the modern philosophy, or the modern intellectual framework, and that postmodernism is positioning itself beyond that, or against that, or in some relation to that. So I think the best way to do that is to go to the sources here. And what you find when you read Foucault and Lyotard, I would throw John Gray, the English-British philosopher, in there. all of them are explicitly saying modernism stood for these things. Right? And they will mention certain metaphysical principles, certain assumptions about human nature, certain assumptions about knowledge and epistemology, about values and science and so on. And they will be very clear, right, about what that modern framework stands for, and then also be very clear that they are rejecting, right, that modern framework. So virtually all of them, there are direct quotations from Richard Rorty, Michel Foucault, John Gray, and so on, saying essentially modernism was realized in the Enlightenment philosophy.
Yes.
Now that's already a very broad characterization with many sub-debates, but essentially what the Enlightenment stood for, we believe that was a failed paradigm or a failed philosophical framework that has now 2 centuries later reached certain cultural manifestations which we think are terrible, destructive, or ultimately empty, and postmodernism has to recognize the failure of the Enlightenment and then move beyond it to something else.
Yes. Please go on.
So as a first glance, I would say, it's hard work, because then we have to say, well, what does modernism stand for? What did the Enlightenment stand for? And then what would the alternatives, right, to that be? So that would be the next thing to drill into for more details.
Yes, I mean there are terms like social constructivism, relativism, performative contradictions, all those things which are attached to this postmodern worldview, I guess. What is it, like a reaction to modernity, the pathologies partly of modernity?
Take the first phrase in your list there, the social construction. And that is a kind of metaphysical claim. So you take the traditional philosophical question, what is real, right? Or what is the nature, right, of reality? And the Enlightenment philosophers, by and large, were naturalistic, right? That the world is the natural world, or the world of physical matter and energy. They, by and large, saw it as a self-contained world of cause and effect. And as a result, that's the world we live in. That's the one that we can study with our tools of reason and experience, and then in more sophisticated form in science with scientific method. And that modern answer to the question of what is real, right, was already a revolution against kind of an earlier pre-modern world that had argued the natural world is not self-contained, or that its cause and effect is not coextensive with it, but comes from a higher world, a supernatural world of spirits, or a supreme spirit, a god. And so that metaphysics, right, the pre-modern metaphysics, we might call it an essentially religious metaphysics, says that reality is essentially spiritual, that there is a God that has a purpose or purposes, and he or she or it, right, created the natural world and perhaps imposed cause and effect on it, or maybe imposes miracles on it when he chooses not to follow cause and effect. But we can't understand the natural world except by reference to a supernatural world. So then we have the traditional philosophical debate about the nature of reality. How is reality constructed, right?
Yes.
And the traditional position says, well, it is constructed by God according to God's purposes, and maybe we can know them and maybe we can't know them. And then the modern naturalistic approach that says reality is the natural world and it goes according to cause and effect. Now, the postmodern position, which comes out of a lot of skepticism. Obviously, there have been skeptical thinkers as long as there has been philosophy. But what happened in late modern philosophy, as we got into the 20th century especially, was philosophy in both the Anglo-American approaches and the continental European approaches, which were then dominating the world of philosophy, became increasingly skeptical, right, about our capacity to come to know anything about, right, reality, right, whether it's the natural world or the supernatural world. So faith, right, mysticism had been widely discredited, right?
Yes.
But then if we turn to the more modern rational epistemologies, right, if we're going to base our knowledge on the senses and perception, right, of the world, well, the philosophers of the early 20th century are concerned with apparent illusions and hallucinations and the apparent relativity of the senses. So how can we say that our sense perception gives us any sort of objective understanding of the way the world is, even at a very basic level? Our data, right, seems initially corrupted. Abstractions, right, and concepts, how can we give them any legitimacy if we want to say that the reality is particular and concrete, but we think of the world in terms of abstractions and universal, right, principles? There doesn't seem to be a connection there. Then language, in many cases, seems to be very fluid and flexible. There's perhaps no one correct grammar, right? Or the semantics of concepts and phrases are very slippery and evolving. So maybe language, right, we don't understand it. And then the tools of scientific method more precisely, logic, mathematics, philosophy of mathematics and logic, right, at that point had also become very skeptical. So what the early postmoderns, right, are doing is standing at the end of a kind of a long and deep skeptical evolution, right, in philosophy. Over the centuries, philosophy goes through phases, right, where it's more optimistic or more pessimistic about knowledge. But what had happened by the middle part of the 20th century was the collapse of logical positivism, the rise of thinkers like Thomas Kuhn, Paul Feyerabend, speaking in philosophy of science. Heidegger was ascendant, right, on the continent. The existentialist thinkers also, right, pessimistic about knowledge and the death of
Thomas
God.
Kuhn played a role, I guess, no?
In the early 60s, yes. Yeah, definitely. And so what they're saying is, look, philosophers have been debating the nature of reality for thousands of years. And, we're just going to say we've made no progress, right, on this. In fact, what we now have is very sophisticated arguments about perception, logic, language, concepts, theory formation, and so forth, all of which are negative. So what we're going to do is to say, look, this whole point of trying to talk about knowledge of reality, whether you take it to be God or the natural world, let's forget that project, right? It's not possible. The idea that we can reach any sort of truth, right, whether it's the modest truths of scientists or the capital T truths of religious thinkers and the Platonists, we're not going to get there. Right? So whatever is going on in our heads, right, if we can use that language, or in our beliefs, right, or in our knowledge, right, whatever it is, can't be about knowledge. It can't be about truth. We can't make sense of this idea of understanding what reality is. So the new position then came to be to say that, look, metaphysics is a pointless discipline, so let's just forget it, right? And whatever we're doing when we're doing philosophizing, if we want to call it that, we need to rethink, right, what that is, right? And that's the postmodern move, to give up on the idea that philosophy is about coming to know an independent, objective reality. Instead, reality is something that I or we make up. As
a social construction, yes.
That's right. Okay, and if you go in the more social direction instead of the more individualistic direction, then you will say reality is just something that we make up socially, and each of us is born into a social tradition, and that tradition constructs our thinking. It constructs perhaps our language, the language through which we do our thinking. So whatever we call reality is then a product of social forces. And that's also a postmodern move fundamentally.
But you hesitated a little bit when I said worldview. So you think more in terms of a philosophy than a worldview in regard of postmodernism?
Well, worldview is perhaps a synonym, right, for philosophy. If you take the world to be equivalent to the sum total, right, of reality. But often when people stop talking about philosophical, right, views and go to worldview, it's a retreat, right?
Okay.
But it still has an objective connotation, right? If you say, well, the world is out there, so it's an ambiguous middle concept, I think.
So now we are with Lyotard and the deconstruction of those grand narratives that science and democracy are like valuable projects. No, that we can access some forms of reality that was recognized as a narrative, like a big narrative, and all, as far as I understand, all we can do is work with those micro narratives now. We cannot relate anymore to some form of objective reality, but it's always a social dialogue, and there begins like a completely new dynamic of things.
Yes, absolutely. So the language of narratives is also indicative of a major transition, right? If you are a realist, right, whether a religious realist or a scientific realist, you will talk about theories. Okay? You have theories about the way the world is. The language of narratives more prominently comes out of the world of fiction, right, where you're talking about stories. And stories, of course, we make up, and we don't worry primarily about whether they are true or internally consistent, right, necessarily. So we'll stop saying, well, I'm not going to talk about whether this theory or that theory is the correct one. Instead, let me just tell you some stories about reality that people believe, and these stories are different and in conflict with each other. And the way, rather, the use of a concept like narrative is to say we can speak, right, of these stories without having to involve ourselves in the question of which one is actually true or not. But then, of course, you can have stories, but you want to have a story that is comprehensive, right, initially, if you are ambitious and optimistic. But then if you start to say, look, just think very universally, very abstractly about the world as a whole, to the extent that you become more skeptical, that sounds less and less likely. So you start to say, let's just talk about this smaller narrative and get away from any idea of big, grand narratives.
Yes.
So you mentioned in the first
just
part
ask one thing?
the normative principles, because there is a whole normative side to this. Yeah, part of the modern Enlightenment project was a belief in universal rights, right, that all human beings by their nature share. And then over the course of the advance of the Enlightenment, you see those rights extended to women, extended to people of other religions, of other races, and so on. But a retreat from any sort of universal understanding of the human condition, that there is a human nature, or that there are objective universal principles that we might call rights, or even universal moral principles of respect, tolerance, and so forth. All of that also is abandoned by postmodernism. So as you suggest, yes, we are in a very different dynamic now.
Let me ask you one question. It's a quote. You wrote in your book, Michael Foucault has identified the major targets. It's in the beginning of your book. All my analyses are against the idea of universal necessities in human existence. Such necessities must be swept aside as baggage from the past. So now, when I'm thinking about this, and there are postmodernists, I think of Professor Thaddeus Russell, who thinks this is the greatest achievement of human history, to be able to get rid of those necessities, right? So that we understand that everything basically is socially constructed, and when you follow this argument, you can get behind it. You know, there's a logic to it. You can understand what he means, but then you can completely take the opposite side, like Professor Jordan Peterson, who sees in that phrasing more like a problem, or I wouldn't say pathology, but it's like more of a problem. So you have one idea from Foucault, and you have like two thinkers who I appreciate a lot, but have completely different stances to this basic idea of.
Sure.
So how do you reconcile that? How do you?
Yeah. Yeah, the Foucault quotation, right, that you give, there is in the Foucault framework one exception to that, and that is the concept of power. And for much of Foucault's career, he was a Nietzschean, right, and described himself as a Nietzschean. So if you abandon the idea of truth as a universal quest or as a universal realizability, or you abandon, as Nietzsche did, the idea of a universal morality and relativize it to fundamentally different biological and psychological types, then you don't have to abandon all universalities, or as Nietzsche did. You could say there is one underlying constant, and that is power in various manifestations. So one way then of reading postmodernism is that it does still have a meta-narrative, right, of sorts, that social construction, right, is very fluid and varied and evolving, but the underlying substratum, right, is the power dynamic. And what goes on constantly is shifting alignments of power forces, right? So that's a kind of a quasi-metaphysics, right, that's possible there. But you're right. Then you juxtapose someone like Professor Peterson with Professor Russell, right, on the reaction, right, to the abandonment of universal necessities. And it is true that one side sees that as a kind of liberation. If you take the idea of universal necessities, as some modern thinkers do, and see that as limiting our individuality, as limiting our freedom. The idea is, well, if there are universal truths and human beings should be subject to all of these universal truths, and I am the one who knows what those universal truths are, that could be taken in the direction of some authoritarian political, outcomes. So it will then be seen as a freeing move philosophically to say, well, there is no universal truth. Nobody has a lock on the way reality really works. So no one should have power over anyone else. And perhaps, I've not read Professor Russell's work directly. Perhaps that's the direction that he wants to go with that. And the other side then is to say we don't necessarily mean by universal necessities, right, any sort of political, right, authoritarianism, but that we are living within a reality and that we do have a human nature. Human beings have certain nutritional needs because of our biological constitution. We have certain psychological needs, perhaps a curiosity for psychological comforts and securities under certain circumstances, the need for love and affection and challenges, sure, and so on. And those are a universal birthright. But all of those need to, whatever it is that we do, right, freely, right, and autonomously in finding ourselves individually, has to be within a certain framework that is in fact imposed upon us by reality. So the next step then would be to have members of those two camps agree initially on what they take those universal necessities to be.
Yes. I mean, it's like in regard of gender questions. I mean, the thing in question was gender polarities. Are they like universal, sure, things? Did they drive us to be at that point in time now, after evolution, or are they completely social constructs?
Sure.
So these are the both ways of dealing with that, and I'm
sure,
always questioning how. Because gender questions are everywhere now, and I'm just wondering how to approach it. They're always heated. You can't really argue with a social justice warrior about one side.
Sure.
It's completely messed up, the situation, in my estimation.
Right. So there, the divide primarily is epistemological, political, right? A hybrid position there. So then you have to, ask the person, right, you're discussing with, do you think that this is fundamentally an empirical question, right? That what we will need to do is set aside what we might like to be the truth, right, about gender identity and its relationship to sexuality and biology, and turn things over to the biologists and the psychobiologists. And what they will do is come up with the best theories about the degree to which things are fixed by biology and the degree to which things are fluid as a result of our individual experiences and social situating. If the person says yes, then we plunge into the theories and we see what the biologists and the psychologists come up with. But of course, as you suggest, in many cases, people are locked into already what we would call broadly a postmodern worldview that excludes there being an objective biological or objective biopsychological answer to that question. They have a normative commitment already, and it's just part of a rhetorical strategy for them to try to exclude any attempt to make it an empirical question at all. So yes. You can't have a debate with them.
Yes. No, because they're following the paradigm of Lyotard that you can't know anything about the objective world by science.
Yeah.
So they try to, as far as I understand what's happening in the United States, they start to question the validity of science itself.
Yes. So what is going on with the postmodernists is the same thing that's going on with the older generation religious thinkers. Right? When there was a conflict between a religious worldview that was very passionately felt, gave people a sense of identity, and they then felt a social mission to convert the world to their way of thinking. But when it started to run into problems with the scientific worldview on any number of issues, their reaction philosophically and politically was to try to shut down the scientific debate, to make that illegitimate. So the exact same psychology, is now in play with this second and third generation of postmodernism. They have their ideological worldview, science, to the extent that it conflicts with that worldview. They will then, as you suggest, then question fundamentally the legitimacy of the scientific project and try to shut it down.
Can you just elaborate on those different phases of generations of postmodernism?
Sure. Well, the first generation of postmodernists, so these would be the truly well-educated intellectuals of the 1950s, 1960s, early 70s. Foucault, Rorty, Lyotard, and the others. And what they were largely doing was developing very powerful arguments, and they were arguments, to show that the arguments on behalf of objectivity, in all of its manifestations, failed. And what you're then left with is, by and large, a purely negative result. There is no possibility of achieving objectivity and universality with respect to reality. What do you then make of that? Then over the course of the 70s, 80s, and on into the 90s, as the first generation kind of cloned themselves intellectually, another generation of professors comes along who have been trained in first generation postmodern thought. And the argument then is to say, well, if all of our stories are just narratives and none of them has any better understanding of objectivity than the other, what we should be doing is giving equal hearing to all of the narratives, all of the worldviews. So what you find then is the argument that, say, women writers have been underrepresented in the literature for centuries, and what we need to do if women are 50%, say, of the population, is make room for about 50% of the curriculum to be women writers, or whatever the appropriate proportion of people's sexuality preferences or their ethnic identities and so forth. So you have a kind of an equal proportional representation is the goal, because none of them is any truer than the other, but they are all legitimate expressions of people's group identities, and we shouldn't privilege one any more, right, than the other. So that turns into a quasi-positive egalitarian, right, movement. And now we are 20 years later from the 90s and so forth. The result of that then is to say, after 20 years, students then have been more exposed to works that fit their own postmodernly conceived group identities. So you will have women who have read women authors, right, predominantly, and you'll have ethnically Hispanic students who have read only Hispanic, right, authors, right, and so forth. And they come to be less aware of and less educated in other groups' traditions. Right? So they are in what we used to call a balkanized, right, situation, where each has its own group. They're reading only things, right, within their own groups. They do not have an understanding, right, really, of the other group's worldview, and their own worldview, as taught to them by postmodernism, is to say, you can't really even understand another group's worldview because your entire way of thinking is shaped by your group and theirs. So there's no possibility of fruitful discourse, right, or conversation across these group boundaries. But at the same time, your group's identity is core to who you are, and your being who you are is an important quest, right, in your life. So the only way for you to realize your identity and to assert your identity, absent civil discourse with an attempt to understand the other group, is going to be through kind of non-rational and even then physicalistic means. So then we see groups not understanding each other, not even trying to understand each other, but being willing to use kind of any tactics, including violence tactics, to achieve their group's ends. And that's our third generation.
Yes, this is. I think I get it now. This is the reason for this whole debate about cultural appropriation, where it's forbidden. Where the whole discussion, where it's like, okay, stay inside your group, don't imitate the values of the fashion of the other group, because you have to stay in your assigned group in a way.
Yes, exactly. And they have to stay in their assigned group, right? So you have a kind of collectivized property rights. You know, many of these thinkers come out of the left, and so it's a little odd to speak of property rights, given their traditional hostility to property rights. But they do have a kind of cultural property rights notion. This is ours, this is our identity. So the way that we define ourselves, as deconstruction taught us, is in terms of difference, right? So if you are trying to appropriate, you're taking away the difference. Therefore, you're taking away my identity, but my identity as a member of a group is fundamental to me, so you're going to be against that. The historical parallels are strong here, because in my book, right, which you mentioned, the early counter-Enlightenment thinkers, individuals like Hamann and Herder especially. You see this in the rise of nationalism in the early 1800s against the more Enlightenment cosmopolitanism and internationalism, especially among the German thinkers, right? Like Herder was to say, you know, his big question was, how had Napoleon, right, one of those damned Frenchmen, right, come into Germany and beaten us, right, so easily? And part of his answer was to say, well, we Germans had too much tried to imitate the French. We had tried to imitate the English. And so what we need to do is kind of put up cultural boundaries, right, against those French imports, against those damned English imports, be authentically German. And on his view, Germans are not especially a rational species. rather bizarre given their amazing scientific and philosophical prowess, but this was Haman's position, that they need rather more ethnically to identify themselves with their group and resist any foreign incursions.
Yes.
So in a way, this third generation of postmodernism is the great-great-grandchildren of Haman, as I sometimes think of it.
Let us just stay there for a moment and talk about postmodern strategy, because, I mean, you wrote your book, I guess, 7 or 10 years ago?
Longer now. Longer now.
Yes.
I wrote it in 2000 and had some challenges getting it published, but it was published in 2004. So,
but the interesting thing is now reading, I think on chapter 6, you read that now, and it's like a perfect description of what is happening when especially if I'm looking at those third generation postmodernists, and I see, okay, they stand up for values like tolerance, empathy, subjectivity, political correctness, and stuff like that. But they do it in a kind of, I would say, aggressive or authoritarianism way of doing things. Yeah. So it's like, and to quote Nietzsche, it's like when I'm engaging a person like that, they are acting as if they were at the same point actors or agitators.
Yes.
They're not really self-transgender, but they're fighting for that, but they're doing it in this very aggressive way. So this duality of aggressiveness and plurality, empathy and all those stuff, it strikes me very odd. You know what I mean? It's just like...
That's right.
How do you...
Well, there is to put it in philosophical language, there always is a performative contradiction, right, in relativism, right? At least it's the epistemological relativism, because it is denying, right, that there is kind of any universal truth or any objectivity, but at the same time, right, one is announcing that relativistic principle as a universal objective principle, right? So you're saying, you know, the universal truth is that there are no universal truths, right? Or the objective fact is that everything is subjective. And how postmodernists, the smart ones, are aware, right, of the tension in trying to formulate this, but in my view, there is no way to get around it. So you will, in action, end up with the kinds of performative contradictions, right, that you're talking about. So you will end up, if you talk about the gender right issues, everyone by now is opposed to traditional sexism, and the view is that sexism really is wrong, right? It's an objective moral sin, right, so to speak, to be sexist, right? But then at the same time, the implication then is that one should then be at least tolerant, right, and get past, right, sexist attitudes. But then that tolerance, right, gets quickly dropped, right, in the social justice, right, form or the postmodern form, right, in favor of a kind of authoritarianism of their views with respect to sexuality. Right? So we go from saying we need to respect individuals' quest to find their own sexuality to you must conform to my understanding of what sexual attitudes should be. Right? So you go from
power aspect. The power aspect.
Yes, that's right. So the power play is very close to the surface. Yeah.
So it's the same with patriarchy. You mentioned that in your book, that you should honor and value all cultures, but the Western patriarchy is bad in all its forms, which is kind of weird because it's such a one-sided view of the patriarchy. I mean, it's like we're living in this society because patriarchy in all of its good forms has created our society, and it's a two-edged sword.
Yeah. Well, I would back away from saying that patriarchy, if you take that, is responsible for what we have accomplished. I think it's true to say that by and large, much of the work of creating modern civilization was the work of men because they had the freedom and the resources, right, to do so. But it wasn't in terms of any sort of philosophical principle that said men should be ruling things, and that is what enabled, right, those accomplishments. You can't say, right, at the one time that patriarchy is evil, right, really evil, if at the same time you're saying there are no objective moral principles, right? You can't say that it's wrong that the poor and the underprivileged, right, don't have access to technology, and then in other breaths say technology is by its very nature a white male phallocentric imperialist imposition on the world, right? That does not mesh. Okay? But then what we want to say is, from our perspective, that's a performative contradiction, and that's going to take us back to the epistemological issues, right, themselves. So what do we think about contradictions? Is that a problem? And contradictions are a problem, right, but only if you think that logic matters, right? And that is to say, only if you think being rational matters. And that's only if you think that the world has an identity, that it goes according to cause and effect, and therefore our understanding of the world has to match the way the world goes without contradiction. Once you have abandoned, right, the idea of any connection to objective reality, that everything is subjective, then it becomes an open question. Well, why not allow contradictions in our thinking? If language really only is a social construct, that it's only a tool that we use in our power struggles, well, if contradictory rhetorical strategies get us what we want, why not? And there's a point in Foucault's History of Sexuality, right, where he makes a very similar point. The language is slightly different, but there he's talking about discourses and rhetorical strategies of discourses, and he says, when you start to think bigger picture, there's no real problem with having contradictory sub-discourses, right, within your overall rhetorical strategy. So the analogy I sometimes think in terms of is if you think about the legal world, a courtroom as a kind of reality, but lawyers and judges approach and the courtroom with different philosophical commitments, right? One sees it as an arena in which we are genuinely concerned with justice, and that means something, and we are going to do our best to assess all of the evidence, and we'll look at the different narratives that the two sides will present, but we will examine them vigorously for internal contradictions and which ones fit with the physical fact, because we can get the truth. Right, and it's important that we try to do that. But to come back to the courtroom analogy, we do know explicitly there are other lawyers, right, who enter the courtroom, and for them, truth, justice, right, is not what it is. The courtroom is only, right, a place where there are power relations, and the goal is to achieve your side's interests, right, no matter what, and any rhetorical strategy is legitimate because, to hell with truth, to hell with justice. We don't believe in those anymore. So, so you have exactly that same modern versus postmodern dynamic played out there.
Yes. One last question. You mentioned modernity and the reaction which led to postmodernity, and there are some discussions when that exactly took place. I'm thinking about that there was this discussion about Prud-Igo, the housing project, when that all fell down in the 60s, I think, and that was the end of modernity and the start of postmodernity. So now we are in this weird situations where we have clearly some benefits and advantages by the development of postmodernism, but also all these problems and pathologies in a way. So now I'm asking myself, how do we get past that point? Where does that lead us? I mean, I know there are some developments in literature and philosophy which go beyond postmodernism. I'm thinking postmodernism metamodernism, performance, all those things who try to get over the pathologies of postmodernism. So, and I just wanted to ask you for your take on that. Where do we go? How do we grow and develop from that point onward?
Yeah, well, I'm torn on that question. I try to do my own crystal ball gazing into the future and predictions. The optimistic side of me wants to say that postmodernism is a skeptical movement, and ultimately it's a nihilistic movement. So when you talk about the social justice warriors, and we see in the news some of their manifestations, it really is thugs, or anti-intellectual people who are literally, in some cases, walking around university campuses with sticks and bats, and they just want to fight. They don't have arguments, They are, I think by the third generation, they're not well educated. You could say of the first generation and the second generation postmodernists, they were well educated. They knew their opposition, they knew the arguments. They had to be in order to earn a legitimate place in the universities. But because of the anti-intellectual nature, of the movement, you expect that their children and grandchildren intellectually will be less educated. So ultimately, once you say there is no truth, there are no legitimate values, there's nothing worth talking about, then people stop talking, and that becomes boring. It becomes uninteresting. And if the only thing you can do is mount a demonstration and try to beat up your opponents, that's a confession of bankruptcy. The smart people who are coming up in the younger generation will say, that is not very interesting to me. I want to do something significant in my life. So they look around, where are the interesting questions in law, in science, in philosophy, and they pick themselves up and start to go and do something, Or if they are artists, they say, I don't just want to do some other, disgusting, perverted thing, I want to do something genuine, as an artist. And so they will go off in a different direction. So the optimistic side of me says that this could and should burn out after this generation. Also, to the extent that things become physicalistic, well, young social justice warriors, you're not going to beat the police, you're not going to beat the SWAT teams, you're not going to beat the National Guard if they get caught up, if it becomes a physical battle in the street, they will lose. The same way, going back to the 1960s, when there was a huge amount of left-wing physical demonstration, and in many cases terrorist movements, Baader Meinhof and others, they lost, and they were driven underground. So if it gets to that point, I think that history will play itself out again. The more pessimistic side of me, though, says that universities are a special place, and because most smart people, not all, there are lots of smart people who don't need university, they just go on with their careers and so on, but most smart people do go to university, and what they learn in those 4 to 6 or 8 years, depending on how much time they spend in university, is formative. They're all intelligent people, passionate in many respects, well-read, but they pick up the prevailing ideologies. And so if you, so to speak, have a captive audience of a whole generation exposed to a narrow worldview that is nihilistic and destructive, then we are going to breed a whole generation of people who are not able intellectually to maintain the institutions of civilization. If they learn that everything is up for grabs, that there is no truth, anything goes, and just impose your will, well, when they assume power, then they will destroy the institutions or weaken them severely. They will not do the work to maintain the underpinnings of our institutions, and that does not bode well for the future. So To go back to the optimistic side, I do also think technology is going to be formative. So perhaps to the extent that universities do not reform themselves internally, it really is primarily humanities departments and closely related social science studies departments, so-called ghettos in which many of them have become. But if they succeed in infecting the entire university, we do have a problem. But with new technologies, we do have the capacity easily to build alternative platforms. So perhaps universities will just be bypassed and people will get their philosophies elsewhere.
Yes. I mean, I think this is the idea of Jonathan Haidt to separate the justice, the humanities, the universities who are promoting humanities, and the universities who were like for the hard sciences, you know, to
sure, yeah.
That, so. No, but I mean,
large universities already are that way, right? The people who are doing good work in engineering, the physical sciences, so on, you know, they're just ignoring what goes on in the humanities. But of course, that leaves the field open to the social justice warriors to have their way with the university.
No, but yes, but last thing, I meant specifically the philosophies of, okay, what is happening after postmodernity? You know, do you have not just a political argument about that or like a social argument, but like a philosophical argument? Can you do you have a vision of like philosophy after postmodernity?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and that was in your original question. I got sidetracked on that. At the same time, I'm optimistic there also philosophically, right, ultimately, because all of the arguments that the postmodernists used did come out of philosophy. So Richard Rorty, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Lyotard, they all had degrees in philosophy. And so that is why, right, they had the power that they did, because the arguments were first-rate and principled and deep. But what has happened since then is that the philosophy, right, within the humanities has by and large moved past postmodernism. There are lots of postmodern philosophers out there, but philosophers as a breed tend to like really good arguments. And so they might play around with, for some years, the idea that we need to be skeptical and so on. But at some point, right, somebody comes along and says, hey, I've got this new hypothesis or this new positive paradigm, right, and so on. And everybody gets excited about that and they go and they work on that. So philosophy was very skeptical in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But since then, essentially this has been my career, philosophers have become increasingly realistic, right, in their approach. So many philosophers are now working with cognitive scientists. So they're working with psychologists, they're working with neuroscientists, right, and so forth, to try to figure out how the human mind, right, actually works. Or many of them have moved past their skepticism about normative principles and become small o objectivist, right, or realist, right, of various forms, and trying to work out how perhaps in an evolutionary psychology way or an evolutionary biology way, there is something universal, right, and objective about morality. There's been a huge increase in interest in applied ethics. Philosophers doing good work in medical ethics and business ethics and engineering ethics. And the assumption is that these are real problems and it's important that we get real answers to them to solve these problems. And even history of philosophy has boomed. Huge interest in Aristotle and Locke and Hegel and Nietzsche and the others. But the entire history of philosophy, or almost the entire history of philosophy as philosophers do it, proceeds on realist grounds, right? That there really is a text, that the text means what it means, and it's important that we understand the philosopher accurately in his or her own terms. So philosophy has its pockets of irrationality, but by and large it's healthy.
But is it a step back to modernistic thinking, you think, like realistic thinking, or is it like, does it integrate the text analysis from postmodernism as well? Is it a step backward or is it a step forward? What is your take on that?
Yeah, I see it more as a step forward, but not a step forward that integrates with postmodernism. And one thing you can say that is good that came out of postmodernism is, since the postmodernists were many of them came out of epistemology focused on language studies, that you did have some very sophisticated, albeit skeptical arguments about language. And what that forced the more pro-realist thinkers to do was develop more sophisticated, realistic understandings of language, right? So that dialectic, right, has been healthy. And to say, okay, fine, we have this understanding of how language and concepts work. That doesn't work. The postmodern criticism of it is fine, but now we come up with a better one, and maybe we came up with better ones more quickly than we otherwise would have. So I see we're making progress.
Yeah, one interesting approach, I think, is the Timothy's Vermeulen Metamodernism, which is like a very optimistic approach, who goes forward and says, well, we can ethically use all those approaches of those previous philosophies and those previous worldviews and try to apply that in an ethical way, so we don't have to reject postmodernism or realism altogether, but take those things which are useful in specific contexts. And I like that idea, because it's like optimistic. It's not
I've heard the phrase, but I'm not familiar with that project in particular.
Well, Professor Hicks.
Yes, good.
We did it.
We should wrap things up as yes, good. All right, well, thanks for having me on. Very good range of questions. Always a pleasure talking about these ideas.
Yeah, I think so too. Thank you very much for doing this.